Okay, this is Philosophy 408, Philosophy of Leadership. I'd like to provide for you a summary of what we've been doing so far and a transition to the last phase of our course. So we're approaching the idea of leadership from a philosophical perspective. That itself is a unique approach to leadership because most books on leadership have really nothing to do with philosophy. And we started off with reading a oration that Giambattista Vico delivered on the goals of education. And in that oration, we found three wisdoms: sapientia, prudentia, and eloquentia. Speculative wisdom, practical wisdom, and wisdom speaking. And for Vico, we found that these are the three goals of education, of a humanistic education. From that, we took a phrase that Vico and tweaked it a little bit, that the goal of education is to understand with certainty, to know with certainty, as Vico says. We tweaked that a little bit, and I turned it into to understand fully. I like that a little bit better. I think Vico might have been under the influence of Descartes at that time of his life, and Descartes' whole idea was about certainty. It's important to be certain about things, but to understand fully, I think, works better for our purposes. So the first kind of wisdom, to understand fully, sapientia. The Greek is sophia. To act rightly. And that kind of wisdom is called prudentia in Latin, or phronesis in the ancient Greek. And to speak with dignity, that kind of wisdom is called eloquentia, or eloquence. Alethine rhetoricae in the Greek. So I've been using this threefold wisdom to structure the course and to speak about the three main qualities of a great leader. I think we should, this could be part of your thesis. I think what was missing in your paper so far is some strong thesis that you're developing that hooks the reader into, and by the way, when you write your papers, don't write for me, write for somebody who's educated that doesn't know anything about philosophy, or, just think about some reader who's educated, but don't write to me, because if you write to me, then you'll assume that certain things that I don't want you to assume. Okay, so these are the three wisdoms, and at the beginning of the course, we took a look at probably one of the most famous passages in all of Plato's dialogues, the allegory of the cave from Book 7 of Plato's Republic. And in that dialogue, we found that Plato maintains that the leaders of a state need to be philosophers. And he believed this. It wasn't just some rhetorical ploy that he used in the Republic, but in the seventh letter, one of the only autobiographical sketches, or the only autobiographical sketch we have of Plato about his own life, he claims that there will be no end to the troubles of the state until politicians become philosophical or philosophers become rulers. And there was a great ruler in ancient Rome that you might want to think about as an example of this. I was thinking about this in my walk today with my dogs in the woods. Marcus Aurelius, there's that wonderful statue in Rome. He was an emperor, and he was a great philosopher. He was a Stoic. He wasn't, we haven't studied Stoicism in this class, but the fact that he was a philosopher, and a great one, and gave us great books, and he was also a ruler, an emperor. He's an example of a philosopher ruler. So there are these three wisdoms: sapientia, prudentia, eloquentia. And to know, to understand fully, to act rightly, and to speak with dignity. But what do these three things mean? That's what I want your papers to be about. So we then turn to two writings in philosophy by two great philosophers, Martin Heidegger, the great German philosopher of the 20th century, and Henri Bergson, the great French philosopher of the 20th century. And we looked at an essay by Heidegger on the essence of truth, and we looked at a little book that Bergson wrote, An Introduction to Metaphysics. And you wrote your first part of your papers on that. What I would like you to do in your rewriting for your final paper, whatever you do speak, whenever you do mention any idea from Bergson and Heidegger, go into a little more depth on that. And once you have your thesis, then you can emphasize those parts that you think are most appropriate to substantiate your thesis in Heidegger. For example, you could point out many leaders when they're understanding a situation, they don't see the situation for what it truly is. They see it how they want it to be, or how they want people to perceive them seeing it a particular way, and for political reasons or whatever. And so you could make a bigger deal about what Heidegger means by letting be, how that's a part, how freedom is letting be, how that's part of aletheia, of unconcealment, and how that enables one to see things as it truly is. That's, and then for example, with Bergson, I was emphasizing the importance of intuition, where Bergson is one of the few philosophers who elevate intuition to a philosophical method and go deep into the nature of intuition, how it reveals absolute reality. And those of you who are using Lao Tzu, the ancient Chinese philosopher, you could emphasize the yin aspect of knowing, the receptive part. So that was part one of the course. What does it mean to understand fully? Part two, which I'd like you to start bringing to a close, not a complete closure, because I want you to go back and rework all this in light of my comments, but either this week or sometime next week, I'd like part two of your paper, like 5 pages double spaced, on what it means to act rightly. And for that, as you know, I want you to use Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, namely mostly book 6, but all the parts on the ethics too. And my essay on political phronesis and the politics of technique, where I show how the 7 principal aspects of technique come into conflict with the practical application of Aristotle's practical wisdom. And I would like you to think and internalize that and think about that, because in the 21st century, as we're living in this age of technology, and techniques are replacing phronesis. The main thing about that paper, for our purposes, is the articulation of the nature of phronesis in Aristotle. I tried to be quite comprehensive about that. But the other part, the thesis, was that the greatest threat to any practical application of Aristotle's political philosophy to the modern world is the substitution of political techniques for phronesis, for practical wisdom. So what that means is any leader is going to come into conflict with techniques and procedures, and that's going to get in the way of their own practical wisdom. So one is going to have to deal with that. And, one could be like in Machiavelli, he speaks about being like a lion and a fox at the same time, strong and noble like a lion, but cunning like a fox. The word cunning doesn't have to mean in a negative sense. It can mean you just know how to move with things and get along with people and still do things your way without making people upset, like a fox. But deal with that however you'd like, but any leader is going to come into conflict with procedures. And my critique of procedures and techniques and how it conflicts with practical wisdom, you could utilize that perhaps for your paper. So let me see what you have. We want to talk about in part 2 of your paper, you're going to have an introduction, which I don't know if you've written yet, but I haven't read it yet. Then part 1, the body of your paper is going to have 3 parts. What it means to understand fully, to act rightly, and to speak with dignity. So I'd like you to use Aristotle and my essay on Aristotle and Jacques Ellul for the second part of your paper. And get that in to me if you can, either this week or next week at the latest, because I want to spend the last part of the course until the end of the semester on the third part, what it means to speak with dignity. So for that, I'd like you to use two texts. One is Plato's Phaedrus, which I'll give you an overview right now, and then I'll go into more depth in another video. And the other is this wonderful book that I learned about in '93 when I received the National Endowment for the Humanities, went to Atlanta, Georgia, to Emory University, and all the, I think there were like 12 great, 12 main scholars on Vico came each week, 2 every week. And it was a Vico Institute there. And many of the people there were teachers of English and classical rhetoricians, and they knew about this book called Classical Rhetoric for the Modern Student. So I learned about that book and I got a hold of it. I required it for this class. It's by Corbett. I'll tell you what parts. Well, if you look at the syllabus for this class, it'll give you indication about what parts of that book. The book is too massive to deal with, the whole thing, but there are parts of it that I'd like you to utilize for the third part of your paper, and as also a tool to actually compose your paper too. And the other text for the last part of the course is Plato's Phaedrus. So I'll just give you an overview today about the Phaedrus, and I want you to read the dialogue, and I'll give you the structure of the dialogue, and then if you read it, I'll give you some indications of how you can use this dialogue for the third part of your paper. So, as you know, Plato wrote about 37 dialogues. And in the dialogue, we encounter Socrates, and that there was a historical Socrates, you all know that. But Plato puts Socrates into the dialogue. So the historical Socrates never wrote anything. So the only way we learn about Socrates is through Plato's dialogues. And there are other means as well, but Plato's the best way. So we encounter Socrates and we learn who he is, and he talks with these people. And Plato expresses his philosophy through these dialogues that he writes, where Socrates is engaged in dialogue with certain people. Now, in the Phaedrus, we find Socrates outside the city of Athens, and he's taking a walk for his health. And from a distance, he meets this character, Phaedrus, his friend, a younger man. You learn about these people from reading the dialogues, but Phaedrus is, we learn from other dialogues, he's a lover of language, and he's a student of Lysias, the great sophist. I need to tell you about the sophist a little bit, so you can appreciate this dialogue a little bit more. So he meets Phaedrus from a distance, and they see each other, and he hails him, and, "Oh, Phaedrus, where are you going? Where are you coming from, my friend?" "Well, I'm coming from the home of Lysias, and I'm going into the country to memorize a speech that he wrote." And he's so enthusiastic about his great teacher, Lysias. Now, Lysias is a sophist. So who were the sophists? Well, in ancient Greece, there were these men who were educators, and it was a profession. The word sophistry means wise man, as opposed to philosophia, which means lover of wisdom. And many of the noble Athenians would send their sons to these sophists to be educated and pay a good sum of money in preparation for a career in politics. And Plato himself, he says in the 7th letter, was destined to go into politics. So these sophists, most of them, didn't believe that there was such a thing as truth. Or they didn't believe that there was such a thing as right and wrong. So there's no truth, there's no right and wrong. So what is there then? Well, there are opinions. Everybody has their own opinion. That's obvious. And every opinion's of equal worth. That's the rub. And so if that's the case, if everyone has their own opinion and every opinion's of equal worth, then what matters most is persuasion, power. If you have power over others, then you can get them to see things your way. If you get them to see things your way, then you have them under your control, and their power is your power. So this is, and they were unconcerned about right and wrong also. What is right is what is advantageous to the powerful. And so sophistry is alive and well today if you watch in politics. It's not like it went away. And they would use any tricks they could find to persuade people, false dilemmas, anything. In fact, Aristotle wrote a whole treatise showing the sophistical, refuting the fallacious arguments of the sophists. It's called the Sophistical Refutations, where we learn about false dilemmas and begging the question and the ad hominem, when you just call people names and have nothing to do with the arguments and so on. So you need to know about the sophists and that Lysias was a sophist. Now Socrates is concerned about, he likes Phaedrus and he's concerned about his well-being. And he knows that he's under the power of Lysias, who's a sophist. And so those first lines are really loaded. Where are you coming from? Where are you going, my friend? Well, where is he coming from? Literally, he's coming from the home of Lysias. But in a more metaphorical way, where he's coming from is his infatuation with sophistical rhetoric. And where is he going? Deeper in, he's going to memorize the speech of a sophist. So he's going deeper into it. I remember back in the 60s, people used to say, you know, where are you coming from? They didn't mean literally. They meant like, what's your orientation? Where, you know, where are you coming from? What do you believe? What are your principles? Okay, so that's how it starts. And so there are many little things that we could reflect on, but I'll just give you an overview now and we'll go into more depth in another lecture. But here's how the dialogue unfolds. So Socrates says, well, do you have the speech with you? Well, at first, Phaedrus pretends that he's memorized it, but it's pretty obvious that he's looking under his cloak and he's reading it. So it's written speech. And he reads it. Finally, they sit under a tree and he reads it to Socrates. Now, one of the hallmarks of sophistical rhetoric was that the rhetoricians believed, the sophists believed, that they could make the weaker argument appear stronger. And what that means is you could take some weak argument and make it appear stronger, persuade everyone to believe in it. If you can do that, that means you have a handle on language. That means you're a master of language. You could take some ridiculous thesis and get everyone to accept it. So powerful is the art of sophistical rhetoric. So this speech obviously has a ridiculous thesis. And the thesis is that it's better to have somebody who's not in love with you to be your beloved rather than someone who's in love with you. That's counterintuitive, right? Wouldn't you want somebody who's in love with you to be your beloved, right? And he gives this speech and he comes up with some pretty good reasons. And a lot of people could be persuaded by that. And Socrates listens and Phaedrus reads it. So that's the first speech. Now that's an example of sophistical rhetoric. It has bad form and incomplete content. It doesn't tell the whole truth. And the form is bad. It repeats itself. He doesn't define his terms. There are many formal weaknesses in the speech. Well, Socrates listens, and usually Socrates is ironical when he hears things that are just so obviously untrue and bad. Instead of just going against it and saying, this is the worst thing I've ever heard, he usually just goes along with, he's being ironical. In fact, Kierkegaard wrote a whole dissertation on the irony of Socrates. He's always being ironical. It's his way of engaging people without irony is one of the most sophisticated of the tropes in classical rhetoric. So he's ironical. He says, well, yeah, that's really wonderful. I'm persuaded. But then he says, I think probably I could give a speech on the same topic, the same thesis, and do a better job. Well, if you can do that, Socrates, I'd like to hear it. Okay, so they sit down and Socrates gives this speech. And this is the second speech of the dialogue. It's Socrates' first speech, but it's really the second speech of the dialogue. The first speech is Lysias' speech read by Phaedrus to Socrates. Now we have Socrates claiming that he can give a better speech on the same thesis. And lo and behold, it is better. It has better form, but he takes the same thesis. It's better to have someone who's not in love with you to be your beloved than somebody who's in love with you. Well, it's so obviously better than Lysias' speech. Phaedrus agrees. It is better. He'll have to tell Phaedrus about this. And then a lot of things happen in between that are noteworthy, but let's pass those. The next big thing that happens is they're crossing this river, and Socrates stops dead, and he claims that his daemon spoke to him. So what is this? What is the daemon of Socrates? Well, he claims it's a voice that dissuades him from going down the wrong path. It never tells him what to do, tells him what not to do. Maybe it's his instincts, but it's definitely not reason. It's just not a feeling. He calls it his daemon. He speaks of it in the Apology where he's defending himself. He says, well, gentlemen, my daemon never spoke to me, so the way I'm defending myself must be the best way. So we hear about the daemon of Socrates. He feels he's blasphemed against the god Eros. Socrates doesn't believe in the gods. We know that. He's in possession of a notion of the one God. It's not the Judeo-Christian God, obviously, because the Greeks didn't know anything about the Jews, and Christ hadn't come on the scene yet, but it's still an understanding of the one. But he speaks of the gods, again, just not to ruffle a bunch of feathers. Sometimes you have to go along with things in order to get something accomplished. So he says, I blasphemed against the god Eros. There was a god Eros, who personification of sexual desire. I need to give another speech. So Socrates now delivers another speech. This is the second speech of Socrates in the Phaedrus, the third speech in the Phaedrus, but it's the second speech of Socrates. And it's called a polynode. A polynode is a particular kind of speech where you take back what you said before, like a recantation, and then you say what you believe. And this is one of the true great speeches of Plato's corpus. It contains everything. One of the great things about Plato's dialogue is that every dialogue tells the whole story. They're like little microcosms. So if you read one, you got the whole of Plato's philosophy. Then you read another one, and you got the whole from another perspective. And you put those two wholes together, they shine a light on each other, and now you have a more full understanding of the whole until you've gone through all the dialogues. That's the way I approached it. So this second speech of Socrates tells the whole truth about Eros. And it's an example of the true art of rhetoric, of what it means to speak with dignity. So you have these three speeches. One is the speech of Lysias, read by Socrates, by Phaedrus, and it's written. That's important. The second one was given impromptu by Socrates. It has good form, but incomplete content. The first speech of Lysias, it had bad form and incomplete content. Socrates' first speech has good form, good style, but incomplete content. And then this second speech, which contains the great myth, one of the great myths, probably second only to the allegory of the cave in terms of importance, or from the most famous of Plato's allegories. It's called The Procession of the Gods, where he speaks of the Eros as the power that elevates the soul, the nature of the soul, and is It's one of the truly great speeches. All the key ideas in Plato's philosophy are contained in that second speech of Socrates. So that's an example of the true art of rhetoric, as in contrast to sophistical rhetoric. And then that ends part one of the dialogue. Part two is a little more tedious to read, but this is the most important part for this course. What Phaedrus and Socrates do, or what Plato does through his creation of this dialogue between Socrates and Phaedrus, they analyze the three speeches, and they show the merits and dismerits of the three speeches. This is where we can learn about what it means to speak with dignity. They analyze the first speech and show how it's limited and gives only one kind of eros, namely purely physical eros. And then the second speech. So that first speech was the example of sophistical rhetoric, bad form, incomplete content. Second speech, that is Socrates' first speech, is good form, incomplete content. He only talks about one kind of eros. The third speech, he distinguishes two different kinds of eros, earthly eros and heavenly eros. So the first two speeches, those were all about earthly eros. It's true, if your desires are based only on sex, sexual desire, then it's better to have somebody who's not in love with you. But then there's another kind of eros, spiritual eros. And Plato has a very highly developed notion of eros. In fact, the philos, and the word philosophia for Plato is really eros, spiritualized. That's why when people say I'm having a platonic relationship, they mean we're not having sex, but that's all that's left of Plato's philosophy. It's sort of, but if one actually reads the dialogues and focuses on what Plato meant by eros, you see you could be having sex with someone and still have a platonic relationship. It just means sex is not the foundation and the only foundation of that relationship, that it's sexual desire spiritualized. So there's so much to that second speech, but I'll just speak of it from a distance and just point out to you that it's an example of the true art of rhetoric. Part two of the dialogue then analyzes the three speeches, as I said. And that's where you can learn about what is the difference between sophistical rhetoric and the true art of rhetoric. The true art of rhetoric would be then eloquentia, or wisdom speaking. So that's the part I want you to draw from the most. Or you can draw from the other part one of the speech too. There's so much in Socrates' second speech. But that's where that material you can use to give some understanding to your reader about what it means to speak with dignity. There's one idea I do want to just point out that I think is most important. It has to do with something Socrates says to Phaedrus. Socrates tells Phaedrus, there will be no end. No, let me start again. He tells Phaedrus, no one will speak with dignity. No one will become an adequate speaker on any subject until one becomes an adequate philosopher. And in the context of the dialogue, what that means is one of the hallmarks of the true art of rhetoric is to speak the whole truth of a subject matter. Remember, eloquentia is nothing other than sapienza che parla, as Vico says, wisdom speaking. So the first two kinds of wisdoms, when they become articulate, then it becomes wisdom speaking, eloquentia, the true art of rhetoric. So why does he say, no one will become an adequate speaker on any subject unless one becomes an adequate philosopher? What he means by that is, in order to become an adequate speaker, when you speak, you have to tell the whole truth of a subject. You can't leave anything essential out. It doesn't mean you have to tell all the details of something. That would take an infinite amount of time. But it just means that that the parameters of your speech should encompass the furthest regions of the topic. So in order to encompass the furthest regions of the topic, that is to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, then you have to have insight into the principles upon which that subject is based. For example, his speech of Eros has insight into the principles upon which Eros is based, because Eros belongs to the soul, for example. So he gives a whole speech. He has to articulate the nature of the human soul, and so on and so forth. So what he means by that is, if you're going to speak adequately about a subject, you have to tell the whole truth about that subject. If you're going to tell the whole truth, you have to have insight into the principles upon which that subject is based. Insight into the principles and the foundations of the arts and sciences is philosophical insight. That's what sets philosophy apart from all the other disciplines. It's the only discipline that questions the foundations upon which all the other disciplines are based. For example, in biology, if you study biology, you're learning all about living things. That's what the word biology means, the study of life. But you never ask, what is life? For that, you have to study philosophy of life. And remember, for Aristotle, in order to have Sophia, you need to combine episteme, that is knowledge, with noesis, the products of noesis, which is intuitive insight into the principles upon which knowledge is based. So with biology, for example, if you study biology, you learn about life. If you study the philosophy of life, you think about the principles of life, you put those together, and then you have wisdom about life. So that's why Phaedrus tells Socrates, no one will become an adequate speaker on any subject until one becomes an adequate philosopher. It means that you have to have insight into the principles upon which the subject is based in order to tell the whole truth. And the whole truth is one of the hallmarks of speaking with dignity. If you just give a partial truth, it can be misleading. And sophists, in fact, contemporary sophists that we find rampant in politics today, they do that, sometimes deliberately, sometimes inadvertently. They give only partial truths in order to gain power over the audience or the listener, the interlocutors. It's all about power, that might makes right. So that's the big difference between sophistical rhetoric and the true art of rhetoric. But there are many other differences too that we could go into. So what I'd like you to do with the Phaedrus is read the dialogue. It can be quite an enjoyable thing. You sort of transport it to ancient Greece. It's a form of transcendence. Without music, philosophy, the arts, religion, whatever turns you on, we need to get out of the four walls, right? We need transcendence. So reading a Platonic dialogue can give you transcendence. You're taken to ancient Greece, which is an incredible thing. And then there you are with Socrates and Phaedrus walking outside of Athens. And so that can be an enjoyable thing if you have the right attitude. So I would sit down 3 times, maybe an hour and a half each time, and read the dialogue Phaedrus. The second part of the dialogue is the most important for our purposes, because you can take that and use it as material to articulate what it means to speak with dignity. One of the main qualities of a great leader. Perhaps your thesis could be the difference between a great leader and a mediocre leader, or just a leader and a great leader. That itself is a worthy thesis. But you need some kind of thesis to integrate your papers. And you also need transitions between the parts of your paper. So the way I envision your paper, you can say whatever you want, but have an introduction. And we'll learn about introductions more when we look at Courbet's book. And then the body of your speech should have 3 parts. One on understanding fully, one on acting rightly, and one on speaking with dignity. And then some kind of conclusion at the end. And all of it should be integrated, developing a particular thesis. And I think the development of a thesis, that way, when you rewrite your paper, you can tweak all your arguments to substantiate that thesis. You want to have something you're saying, otherwise it's just rambling. When there's take a thesis, like great leaders are uh, um, the difference between a leader and a great leader is that great leaders are lovers of wisdom, and then or something like that. But you need some kind of thesis. That's what I found wanting in your papers. The other thing I found that you need to, whatever you do talk about in these philosophers, go into a little more depth. Um, there's no way you're going to talk about all the ideas in each of these readings I gave you. But whatever you do choose, go deep into it. Get a quote, think about it, and articulate it. Make sure that your reader understands. Don't assume that the reader understands things. Don't write to me. Write to some. Think about some uh, reader who's intelligent but not a philosopher like me. Okay. All right. I hope this helps, and I'll be looking forward to reading your um, part 2 of your essays. I'll give you some feedback on that. So if you can get those in to me this week or next week, it'd be fine. And then we'll work on part 3. So work on the Phaedrus. Okay, thanks. Peace.